Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, let me first ask unanimous consent that Gifford J. Wong, who is an American Association for the Advancement of Science Fellow in my office, be granted floor privileges for the remainder of this Congress.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Americans across the board recognize the growing threat of global climate change, and last week was a big week on the conservative and corporate sides. New polling revealed strong support among conservatives for smart policies to stem carbon pollution. And coalitions of leading corporate voices, 6 major banks, and 10 major food and beverage companies called on us to join them in backing strong climate action. So I come to the floor today, now for the 114th time, to join with them, with scientists and lay people, with military commanders and faith leaders, with environmentalists and capitalists, with Democrats and Republicans, all saying it is time to wake up to this crisis. Yes, Mr. President, I said, and Republicans. Outside this chamber, Republicans are calling for action on climate. The poll out last week, conducted by 3 leading Republican pollsters, showed a majority of Republican voters, including 54% of conservative Republicans, agreeing that the climate is changing and that human activity contributes to the changes we're all seeing. And they want solutions from us. The same proportion of conservative Republicans, 54%, would favor a carbon pollution fee on electric utilities, provided the revenue would then be rebated to consumers. A carbon fee, as we know, is a market-based solution, very much in line with conservative principles. I recently introduced a bill that I hope both Republicans and Democrats could embrace. It would establish an economy-wide carbon fee on carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions, and then return 100% of the money to the American people. It would work. A recent analysis said it would reduce U.S. carbon dioxide emissions by nearly 50% by 2030. The revenue would offset annual payroll taxes for every working person by $500, with a similar benefit to veterans and Social Security recipients. It would reduce the corporate income tax rate from 35% to 29%. And it would return the remaining funds to states to be used locally for transition costs, efficiency investments, or whatever the states prefer. With this bill, I extend to conservatives what my very conservative friend, former Republican Congressman Bob Inglis, has called not just an olive branch, but an olive limb. Whether you want tax reform, a proper free market for energy, or even to address climate change, please, let's get to work. To state the obvious, Congress has been ruled by the lobbyists and political enforcers for the fossil fuel industry. The fossil fuel industry, with political threats and very big money and lots of phony front groups, has made the Republican Party in Congress its political wing. But outside this chamber, where conservatives don't need fossil fuel industry money, there is considerable conservative support for a carbon fee, from leading right-of-center economists, conservative think tanks, and former Republican officials. President Nixon's Treasury Secretary George Shultz, President Reagan's economic advisor Art Laffer, President George W. Bush's Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, and Bush Council of Economic Advisors Chair Greg Mankiw have all advocated for some form of a carbon fee as the efficient way to correct a market failure. The market failure where we all have to pick up the costs of carbon pollution for the fossil fuel industry. No wonder they spend so much money around here. That market failure is a sweet deal for the fossil fuel fellas, but it is not good free market economics. In a 2013 New York Times op-ed, former Republican EPA administrators Bill Ruckelshaus, Christine Todd Whitman, Lee Thomas, and William Riley wrote, "A market-based approach like a carbon tax would be the best path to reducing greenhouse gas emissions." End quote. Republicans in Congress are being squeezed. On one side, they see unequivocal scientific consensus, compelling economic theory, and mounting public opinion, all pointing toward the need for strong action on climate. On the other side, they see rich and powerful polluters who fund their politics and who make heavy-handed threats against any Republicans who might dare to cross them. That's why it was such glad news, Mr. President, when a group of 11 House Republicans, led by Congressman Chris Gibson of New York, introduced a House resolution committing to address climate change by promoting ingenuity, innovation, and exceptionalism. Now, that's not a bill yet. We've got a ways to go still, but it is another sign that the denier castle is crumbling. First, climate change was a hoax. Then, okay, maybe it's not a hoax, but it's just natural variation. Then, okay, maybe it's real and humans do cause some of it, but look, it paused. Then, okay, maybe it didn't pause, but we really can't do anything about it. And then, okay, we can do something about climate change, but please stop asking me about it because I'm not a scientist. And now this, a resolution by sitting Republican House members that we need to take climate action. It's been quite a journey. The escape of 11 Republicans from the dark, crumbling ramparts of Denier Castle gives dawning hope to Americans that bipartisan action on climate change is becoming possible, even in Congress. Last Thursday, Congressman Gibson and I joined together, bicameral and bipartisan, to hear from major food and beverage companies how climate change affects their industry, their supply chains, and their bottom line. It marked, as far as I can recall, the first time in years that a sitting Democrat and a sitting Republican member of Congress joined in a public event on climate change. I hope that's another sign that things in this building have begun to shift. For these big companies, climate change is not a partisan issue. It's not even political. It's business. It's their reality. Climate really matters to our business, Kim Nelson of General Mills told us. We fundamentally rely on Mother Nature. The choices we make to protect or forsake our climate, she said, will be important to the long-term viability of our company and our industry. Paul Bacus of Nestle agreed, impressing on us that this is not a hypothetical. Climate change is impacting our business today, he said. His company, Nestle, cans pumpkins under the Libby's brand. They've seen pumpkin yields crash in the U.S. We have never seen growing and harvesting conditions like this in the Midwest, said Mr. Bacus. Chief Sustainability Officer for Mars, Barry Parkin, was more blunt. We are on a path to a dangerous place. These companies are reducing carbon emissions and demanding sustainable supply chains. Mars, for example, recently invested in a 211-megawatt wind power farm in Texas to offset all of the electricity used by its U.S. operations. Unilever, in addition to shifting away from fossil fuels towards renewables and biofuel energy, is also fighting deforestation associated with farming. Message one from these businesses was, this is important. Message two was, they can't do it alone. They need us in government to pay attention. Business, government, civil society, and individuals all have a part to play, said General Mills. We need governments to be involved, said Unilever. Specifically, the companies want a strong global climate deal at the Paris conference this December. They released a joint letter pledging to accelerate their own climate efforts and urging governments to do their part as well. They even took out full-page ads in the Washington Post. Here it is. And also in the Financial Times, right here, on the very day of our event, showing the full text of their letter and the signatures of the 10 CEOs. The letter says, climate change is bad for farmers and agriculture. Drought, flooding, and hotter growing conditions threaten the world's food supply and contribute to food insecurity. State the heads of Mars, General Mills, Nestle USA, Unilever, Kellogg Company, New Belgium Brewing, Ben & Jerry's, Cliff Bar, Stonyfield Farm, and Dannon USA. Here's what else they pledged. We will use our voices to advocate for governments to set clear, achievable, measurable, and enforceable science-based targets for carbon emission reductions. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that this letter from the heads of these 10 major food and beverage companies asking world leaders and us here in Congress to act on climate change be submitted to the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. We heard a similar appeal from America's largest financial powerhouses, Bank of America, Citi, Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, and Wells Fargo released a strong call for governments to come together on a climate agreement. Here's what they wrote. Policy frameworks that recognize the costs of carbon are among the many important instruments needed to provide greater market certainty, accelerate investment, drive innovation in low-carbon energy, and create jobs. While we, speaking of each other, may compete in the marketplace, we are aligned on the importance of policies to address the climate challenge. I ask unanimous consent that their statement also be submitted to the record.
Without objection.
These are serious people running big, successful companies. They don't take climate change lightly. They don't scoff. and neither should we. They're asking that elected officials find the courage to address climate change. Majorities of voters of both parties and of independents also are asking that elected representatives find the courage to address climate change. And that brings us back to that squeeze I talked about. If you're not willing to address carbon pollution and the climate change and ocean acidification it is causing, I ask my colleagues who are on the ballot in 2016, what are you going to say? What are you going to say to your voters? Are you going to say it's a hoax? Great. Good luck with that. Are you going to say, okay, it's real, it's important, these companies are all right, but as far as fixing it, well, we've just got nothing. Because right now, that's what they've got. Nothing. Or maybe they should just beg, please don't ask me about climate change, because the big fossil fuel polluters are paying my party's bills and making mean threats to me. Not a great set of options. At some point soon, I would tell my friends, your party's leaders are going to have to go to the fossil fuel billionaires and say, enough. Enough. Let my people go. We held out for you as long as we could, but now you've got to let my people go. And it has to be soon. As one executive told Congressman Gibson and me quite directly, and I quote, the window of opportunity to act on climate change is closing. Mr. President, it is time to wake up. I yield the floor.